YouTube. I'm making this video in response to "In a Radical Feminist World, There is No Transphobia," posted by Heather. I don't know if she has a YouTube alias, on Zinnia Jones' channel. Hey Heather, first of all, I want to thank you for making this video. Thank you for putting a feminist view out in the atheist free thought community, which can be, as evidenced by our atheism among other places, not the most friendly to or well-versed in feminist ideas. It is because so many of your ideas in this video are so spot on that I feel compelled to call you out where your arguments and reasoning fall short. Let's start with the title of your video. In a radical feminist world, there is no transphobia. In order to ascertain the validity of this thesis, we must first define radical feminist world. You start your video by outlining for us one of the basic axioms of radical feminism, that most gender is performed. Later, you go on to sketch out a radical feminist utopia where activities, interests, and personal traits hold no association with a particular gender. You propose that gendered words themselves would at this point become irrelevant. On the surface, this would seem to be an extremely liberatory platform from which to work against transphobia. In a world where trans people arguably suffer the most violence at the hands of those who enforce gender, wouldn't it make the most sense to do away with it all? Unfortunately, the answers are not as simple as this. Let's take a moment to revisit the word transphobia. You don't really provide a concrete definition of what transphobia exactly is, so I'm going to work with the definition that transphobia is the active suppression of and violence towards people with non-cis gender and sex identities. A world where gender seems to lose all meaning may seem an ideal way of eradicating gender-based oppression, but really it would simply set up a new system of gender-based oppression, one where trans people were robbed of their ability to talk about their experiences, one where transgenders are actively suppressed. Many trans people will never lose their need to articulate their gender, because gender, especially gender variance, is something that is experienced internally in addition to something that is performed and viewed. Cis people are often not conscious of this feeling because conflict has never forced them to examine it, but even for cis people, the sensation of gender is still there. You acknowledge this in your defense of the existence of trans people, but your defense begins to fall apart when put in the context of your gender-free world. I don't follow how people who innately feel they are men or women can be allowed to exist in a world where, as you put it, the words man and woman are meaningless. Gender identity of any sort is policed out of existence by what would seem to be an unrelenting wave of gender abolitionism. I want to be clear here that I am by no means denying the pervasive and insidious presence of the patriarchy. Patriarchal power is definitely exercised through the enforcement of prescribed gender roles. Gender abolitionism, however, is not the answer. One who thinks it is missing the forest for the trees. Gender is merely one of the tools through which patriarchy functions, and to read gender as merely an extension of the patriarchy is to only see the narrowest of possibilities that gender can offer. More disconcertingly, you argue that not only is this a utopian fantasy, but that this is something that is already in the process of happening. To which I say, bullshit. Trans women are murdered in the streets every day, and you ignore this, instead citing the androgynous bodies of Olympic athletes, themselves heavily policed by the gender policies of the Olympic Committee, as some sort of evidence of mainstream acceptance of gender variance. You even have the nerve to insinuate that the stakes are somehow lower now than they were for feminists of generations before us, completely ignoring the fact that trans women, not to mention cis women of color, are still fighting for the same rights we feminists supposedly won for all women. The fact that trans women are fighting against voter disenfranchisement in this very election is a perfect illustration of how little was actually solved by first wave feminism. Instead of this notion of gender abolitionism, I subscribe to the idea of gender liberationism. Gender need not and should not be abolished, but instead celebrated for what each individual makes of it. If someone identifies within a binary, that's fine. If someone doesn't identify within a binary, that's fine too. Everyone should have the right to experience and articulate their gender however they choose. Words wouldn't become meaningless. Perhaps they would become more complex, but never meaningless. As long as gender and sex continue to have meaning to people, there will be a need for gender in our society. And people who feel negatively about the idea of gender as a whole simply need to square with that. I want to end with a quote from trans activist Julia Serrano, and I'm quoting her now. Instead of trying to fictionalize gender, let's talk about the moments in life when gender feels all too real. Because gender doesn't feel like drag when you're a young trans child begging your parents not to cut your hair or not to force you to wear that dress. And gender doesn't feel like a performance when, for the first time in your life, you feel safe and empowered enough to express yourself in ways that resonate with you rather than remaining closeted for the benefit of others. Let's stop trying to deconstruct gender into non-existence and instead start celebrating it as inexplicable, varied, and interesting.